Hello, fellow gardeners, homesteaders, and cooks. I thought I would throw together a quick fresh tomato salsa. And this is one of my very favorite things to make in the summertime. This is like the reason I grow tomatoes and peppers. There's just nothing like it. What I have here is a mix of, these are an Anaheim style pepper. They're actually called Joe Parker, and they're one of the varieties that are grown in Hatch, New Mexico for roasted Hatch chilies. I lived in the Four Corners area of Colorado for years, and we spent a lot of time down in Albuquerque and Santa Fe because that was fairly close. And the local Walmart in Durango would bring in a truckload of Hatch chilies, and they would roast them out in front of the grocery store. So I just was around those kind of chilies for a very long time living there, and completely fell in love with New Mexico cooking, which is not the same as Mexican cooking. There's a difference in the cuisine between Mexico and New Mexico. And so when I moved to Washington, I was determined that I was going to grow the same kind of chilies, even if I couldn't match, the growing conditions of Hatch, New Mexico, that makes them so incredible. So I did a bunch of research, got online, because there is no such thing as a Hatch chili. That isn't a variety. It's the name of the town. And they actually grow a bunch of different kinds of chilies in Hatch, based on the production, what they're going to become, where they're going, whether they're going into cans or whether they're going to get roasted and eaten fresh. And then also how spicy you want them. So there are mild, medium, and hot Hatch style chilies. And so in that research, it turns out that Hatch works very closely with New Mexico State. And New Mexico State has a breeding program, and they are actually the originator of many of the chili varieties that are grown in Hatch, New Mexico. And so further digging, figured out which varieties I wanted to try. Joe Parker is kind of a mild, just slightly spicy chili. And I also tried growing Big Jim, which is very similar. Honestly, I couldn't tell the difference, and so I just defaulted to Joe Parker after that. And I buy the seeds directly from New Mexico State. I'll leave a link down in the description. They actually sell a lot of the varieties that they've originally bred. And so if you've ever seen a package of seed at the store or on wherever you buy them from, and the abbreviation in front of the name is NUMEX, New Mex, that means that it was bred by New Mexico State. And they're actually all over the place. There are a lot of seed companies carry their stuff. But very cool, and I thought it was fun to buy directly from them. The other chili that I'm in the process of cutting up here, or cutting the tops off of, are shishitos that have gotten ripe. I had a weird thing happen this year where I bought seed that said poblano, and then it turned out it was not poblano, and so I grow poblanos to dry for some of the spice mixes that I make. And so I put in 32 plants, and 36 plants, and 29 of them turned out to be shishito instead of poblano. So yeah, that was a rude surprise. But it turns out I now have 1 million shishitos, so I've been selling those through the food hub that I belong to. But if you want the plants to keep producing, you need to pick them off when they turn red. And every once in a while, there'll be a small one. They're not normally this small, but the small ones will turn red, and then it tells the plant that it's done and it stops growing new fruit. And so you need to take those small ones off when they're red, even if they're not as big as you want them to be. And so I have a mix here of the Hatch style Joe Parker chilies, and then the shishitos. Shishitos don't have a lot of heat. They're really, really mild when they're green. They do get a little bit of spice to them when they're red, but it'll be fine in a salsa. So I'm just going to use these up because I actually forgot that I picked a bunch of these Hatch chilies, and I forgot that when I was sorting them for what I was selling versus what I was keeping, I had dumped a bunch of these ripe shishitos in the same bag with the Hatch for home use, and I completely forgot they were in there. And so when I went to pull out the Anaheim-style chilies. Suddenly there was a whole bunch of shishitos, and I thought, that'll be okay. That'll work in a salsa. And these are small, so they're, I mean, you know, probably 6 or 7 of these is the equivalent of one Anaheim chili. So a little is, we're gonna use them up. It'll be fine. This is a really big shishito. They're not normally, you want to harvest them when they're probably about that length, a couple inches, when they're green. And this one I just missed, and it got really big before it turned red, which also happens. Cut these slightly. And I'm just going to make this recipe in the food processor. You could probably also do it in a blender if you did it in small batches so that you didn't just end up with soup. Or you can obviously hand cut everything. And I think you all know how to hand cut things. You don't need me to demonstrate how to do that. And I have food processors because they make short work of exactly this kind of thing. So on the hatch, usually you can dry them. You can use them red. You can dry them and use them red, either way. But normally they're used and roasted green. And so some of these are in here simply because they were starting to turn color. And so not as sellable for what people are normally used to. They do get pretty seedy when they're big like this. The shishitos, the seeds are so small that I don't really need to seed them. These guys, I'm going to have to take the seeds out. If this was a hotter pepper, I would not be doing these with my bare hands. I learned the hard way one time. I was cutting up and seeding a bunch of Aleppo peppers, and I did it with my bare hands, and my hands literally hurt for 2 days. And I didn't think they were that hot when I did it. I didn't realize, and they just about killed me. So I learned a very hard lesson. If it has any real spice to it at all, even jalapenos, if I'm doing more than just 1 or 2, I will put some gloves on. Okay. So we're just gonna put these in here and give them a quick chop. And this is probably more than I really need for this salsa, but I wanted to use this stuff up. So I might put some of this aside and just throw it into some eggs or something. You know, meal prep. And on this kind of thing, you just want to pulse it. You don't want to turn it on. You just want to. And as that motor comes on, it kind of kicks everything up, which means things keep moving around and getting chopped. Maybe one more. It's the kind of thing where you can drive yourself crazy second guessing. And you can make your salsa as chunky or as not chunky as you like. It's totally up to you and your own preference. Yeah, there's a few. I'm going to do some onion next, and so anything that's like super chunky, I'm just going to throw it back in here. These little shishitos, they're thin-walled. And they're a little bit drier, and so they're not as juicy, so they don't tend to chop quite as easily. All right. Boy, does that smell absolutely amazing. Gonna want an onion. The last of my store-bought onions before I switch over to exclusively the ones I've grown. It has been really hot, and it's been very hard to get out there and pick things. I tend to go out thinking I'm going to pick something, and then I get distracted by how overgrown the weeds are. And so I start weeding, And then I lose my window. It's too hot, and I end up thinking, oh, they can last another day out here. They'll be okay. And so I don't get things picked. So there's a tiny bit of mold happening in between the layers there. You may have noticed that. If it's not penetrating the actual onion, it's just in between the layers, that just washes right off. You do you if you're not comfortable with that. Go down another layer and eliminate it completely. But I just rinse it off and it's fine. Okay. I'm going to roughly chop these. I definitely like my onions fine. I am not a big fan of really chunky onions. I don't usually follow a recipe when I do this. I've been doing it for so long. But just so that you guys can see this, I'm going to throw it in a measuring cup. And my rough rule of thumb is I like to have about the same amount of onions as chilies. And then about double that. So I have about a cup of onion there. And again, usually I just kind of eyeball this, but just so you guys can see. So I'm going to add another cup of chilies. My hands are probably going to regret that. Okay, so that's a little more than 2 cups, but close enough. The rest of these I'm just going to store for making eggs and things. All right, and now for the tomatoes. So we've got a cup of onions, a cup, give or take, of chilies, and now I want about 2 cups of chopped tomatoes. Our tomato season is just getting going. These are, we've had some heat waves, so there's been some watering issues, which is where this blossom end rot is coming from. And so some of these are in really good shape. Some of them are definitely split, and so I'm going to use the scratch and dent split ones because they are not going to hold. And everybody has different lines in the sand for what they're willing to eat when it comes to damaged produce. I spent, I started planting this garden in January. I think I bought seeds this year in December. And I started the seeds in the greenhouse in early March, usually the first week to the second week of March. I planted them out in May. It's now the 9th of August. So June, July, August. So that's 3 months of watering these every 3 days, fertilizing them on occasion, pruning them up, putting up shade cloth. I am not going to not eat something because it has a little bit of damage on it. I've spent a huge amount of time and effort getting to this point. And so for me, you can cut away the bad bits, and the plant is still on the vine. It's still growing. It's doing just like you. If you get injured, you scab. Plants, if they're still on the vine and alive, will often scab over any damage, which is what these have been doing. And so there's no rot here for the most part. They're just split. It's a minor issue. The real problem is like this one is underripe, and it's really not going to store well sitting on the counter. So it's going to be, we're just going to cut it up. It's going to be slightly underripe going into the salsa, but there'll be enough flavor in there that it won't make a big difference. But most of these are pretty awesome. That green shoulder, that's also growing conditions. We've just had several years of weird weather. Yeah, it's been kind of unseasonably. We always get really hot days in early August, where it's often up in the high 90s or low 100s. But the last 2 years we've been getting hotter sooner and more hot. So we reached 110 last week, and then we had a break briefly, and now we're, I think it was 108 yesterday. So awfully hot weather. And that makes it really hard to grow a garden. So I have shade cloth up. I'm doing all the things. I really need to do some research on tomato varieties, especially that do better in warmer temperatures. So probably varieties that might be better suited in the south, and see if, trial a few of those and see if they're better. Because what happens is when it gets hot, the tomatoes don't set fruit. The pollen is no longer viable on the male flowers, and so they bloom, and then the blooms just fall off because they never actually get pollinated because there's too much heat. Which is funny because I think humans have a similar issue where guys sometimes are infertile because there's too much heat around their baby-making parts. And the solution to that is to wear looser underwear and looser pants. So it turns out that tomatoes are similar in that way. All right, so most of these, there's another one. Most of what's left in here look pretty good. That one's got a little bit of damage at the top. And I'm looking for about 4 cups of tomatoes here, but, you know, give or take. As long as it's in the ballpark, it's going to be fine. I'm not worried about this. And, you know, if you like your salsa with more tomatoes and less onions and peppers, do that. If you like your salsa with a lot more onions and peppers and only a little bit of tomatoes, do that. Lots of different ways that we can go. It's all just personal preference, but I think it's handy to have an idea in your head of a ratio so that you can then adjust it. If you never have that in your head, then it's always, things come out differently every time. And a ratio is just a part. And so if I had, you know, I'm doing basically a 1 to 1 to 2 ratio on this salsa. If I had 1 tablespoon of onion, 1 tablespoon of peppers, and 2 tablespoons of tomatoes, or if I had 1 gallon of onions, 1 gallon of peppers, and 2 gallons of tomatoes, that's still the same ratio. So it doesn't matter what the actual measurement is as long as it's the same between the things that you're doing. There's a really great book, I'll put a link in the description, by Michael Rollman called Ratio. And it's all about how he was training as a professional chef, and he suddenly realized that a lot of recipes that he had never realized were actually operating from a ratio and how much easier it makes it to riff on things when you're cooking, if you know that. And so he wrote a really great little cookbook called Ratio that's all about the common ratios in cooking. It's fun. And this is another one of those fine lines where you don't want it too soupy, you know, where it's just completely pureed. Or maybe you do. It's up to you. But you also don't want a chunk that's so big it doesn't fit on a chip. So there's a trick to that too. All right. So this isn't going to measure out exactly because all the juice is going to fill in all those little cracks there. But it'll give you an idea. So we should come out to around 6 if everything was not filling in. And actually, I should have looked at the side of this. This does have measuring on it, and I always forget it. But we're at 5. And I would assume that there's probably, actually we're almost at 6. Yeah, that's 5.5. And we're going to assume the juice is about 1/2 cup. So I think we came out pretty good. So that's your basic salsa, those 3 ingredients. And then the other absolutely essentials, in my opinion, are lime juice and salt. So salt, definitely a critical element in terms of making everything come together. I'm going to start with a teaspoon of just regular table salt. This is sea salt, and see how it tastes. To some extent, this is personal preference. It's also how salty your chips are can make a big difference. And so if you've got, you know, and they seem to vary quite a bit depending on brand and sometimes even within the brand, just time of when you bought them. So go with that as well. But you definitely need a good dose of salt in there. And then I would say juice from at least 1 lime. That lime juice flavor is what really makes it. If you hate lime, you could probably use lemon. If you were really in a pinch, you could probably use a vinegar, like a really neutral vinegar, like maybe just white vinegar or apple cider vinegar. But my preference by a very long way is lime. This is a huge lime. I like to squeeze these, and that is the direction you're supposed to go. And then I fold them in half and squeeze them a second time. And you can usually get another tablespoon or so out of there. When you're choosing limes at the grocery store, I read this trick somewhere, I can't remember, and it really is true. Feel the skins as you're like going through the bin. The ones that feel like they're thinner skinned or smoother, you get a lot more juice out of them. The really thick-skinned ones, they tend to be dry. I don't know why that is, but it does make a huge difference. All right, so juice from 1 lime. Again, if we were making more or less, we would want to reduce that or increase it. Oh, garlic is the other thing I'm not putting in here. I gotta get some garlic going. That is really important. Classic. Oops. That trick is one of the best things I ever learned for cooking, for peeling garlic. Peeling garlic is so fiddly. And just smacking it with your knife just enough to crack the skin makes all the difference. I'm going to run this through my rasp grater. You could use just a regular garlic press, or you could dice it. The finer it is, the stronger that garlic flavor is going to be. And this is definitely something I want a good solid hit of garlic in. You could put as much in as you like. I tend to be somewhat conservative with garlic. I know there are people that say you cannot have too much garlic. I disagree. I think that it should not dominate a dish and be the only thing you're tasting. And so I like it, but I use it judiciously. So you could, I mean, some people would put, 3 or 4 cloves of garlic in there. That was a big clove of garlic. It was about the equivalent of 2 regular sized cloves. All right, we're going to give this a good stir. And salsas are always better if they've been sitting for a little bit. So we're going to let this sit, and then we'll come back. Boy, those shishitos did not really chunk up as much as I'd like them to. They were a little rubbery, and that food processor is not my favorite in the world either, and so didn't quite cut them up as much as I like. Okay, so we've got everything stirred in. We need that garlic and the onion and the peppers and the salt to all kind of blend with those tomatoes and lime juice. I am going to give it a quick taste just to test for salt, but it's going to be much better later. Yeah, that's good. And it's got a little bit of a kick. Those shishitos have got some heat when they're red. Woohoo! Okay. We'll come back and do a taste test in a little bit. All right, this tomato salsa has been sitting for probably a little over a half an hour. So time for everything to blend. Yum. And when you're tasting this, what you're asking yourself is, does it have enough heat? Does it have enough acid? And does it have enough salt? I feel like this maybe could just use a pinch more salt. There's a little heat kick from those shishitos that were ripe in there. I think we're pretty good on the acid. Tomatoes are naturally acidic, and then of course you add that lime juice, and that's going to add a little more acid to the mix. But I think it's glorious. Fresh salsa, so good. If I had some cilantro, I would put it in here. I don't have any fresh right now. It's a very hard herb to get to grow in the heat of the summer. But cilantro would be another nice addition to this. Very tasty.